My name is Terry Gunning. I'm a VP at CGI, which is a Canadian-based technology firm that has a global footprint. More importantly, and more relevant today, it has about 250 people working here in the local community. Today's topic, black swans, the improbable events. Are they the new normal? Are they unpredictable events, from pandemics to cyber attacks to economic crashes and natural disasters causing massive disruption? As we move into this discussion, I ask you to kind of think back over the last 100, 50, 20, 10, 5, 2 years, and what stands out to you as major natural disasters, or what disruptive events have affected you? For me, some of them are the Great Depression, World War stand out, but really for me over the last 5 to 10 years, there feels to be more black swan events that have occurred. So as Dr. Druckman goes through and has this presentation and speaks to you about this, think back about what the last 100 to 200 years, all the way up into the last 2 years has really affected you. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Myles Druckman. Dr. Druckman is a SVP at the Global Medical Director at International SOS, and is well known as an author, media resource, and thought leader in international corporate health, pandemic planning, and health innovation and technology. Dr. Druckman has been with International SOS for more than 20 years, spending 10 years working in Russia and China. Dr. Druckman is based in Los Angeles, where he provides expertise to global organizations on health risk management and workforce resiliency. Dr. Druckman is also co-chairman of the non-profit International Corporate Health Leadership Council and is an alumni of World Economic Forum's Global Leaders of Tomorrow's Network. Today, we also have moderating with us is Jim Hayhurst, and Dr. Druckman will walk through his presentation, and then Jim will moderate some facilitated conversation afterwards. Over to you, Dr. Druckman.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for joining today. Black swan events and expecting the unexpected. So we were laughing a little bit before we started. The picture that you see there is actually just over 30 years ago, myself and Jim Hayhurst, our moderator, and we are on the banks of a river in Siberia on an Arctic expedition. And as you can see, Jim, who's on the right, is sporting a nice eye patch because he had a piece of metal go fly in his eye, and I was the medic and the doctor for the trip. So we had to basically remove his eye in the middle of the forest, not his eye, the particle in his eye. And that was definitely not something we expected. But fortunately, I had all the equipment, I had all the gear, and he had the bravery to suffer through it, and we survived that event. But I think it's an interesting kind of segue into this topic of what to expect in a crisis. And planning is important. And so if I didn't have the equipment to help remove that piece of metal from Jim's eye, it could have been a much different situation. So a man who does not plan long ahead will find trouble at his door, and that's Confucius. And having spent some time in China, you can see how the Chinese have a long-term view on a lot of things, and there's a reason for it. So before I start, I'd like to throw a little picture at you all. Have a think about this and how it relates to the pandemic that's going on right now. And at the end, I'll let you in on the story there. So as I start, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the 30,000 foot view of what's going on around the world with a pandemic. And, we're all being inundated in the news about this COVID-19 outbreaks around the world. Unfortunately, as you can see, the chart is going up at quite a steep rate. So we're really ultimately not that far along. We haven't in this pandemic. And pandemic, by definition, means everywhere in the world will ultimately be affected. So it's just a question of time, and it's a question of whether you get 1 wave, 2 waves, 3 waves, or more. And so, we're still, unfortunately, in the early stages, and a lot of the world has not really been impacted. It's been very much a Europe and North America, or America's phenomena. And Europe is seeing a significant rise in cases. If you track, the fatalities around the world, over the last 3 or 4 weeks, Europe has kind of taken over as it's really exploded in that part of the world, and of significant concern. But you could see other countries and other regions of the world being affected. And the US, though there's been a lot of, obviously media being based in the US, it's not the only thing that's going on, and elsewhere around the world is being affected too. Globally, if you start to compare country to country, you can see France, the UK had significant outbreaks. The US is a little bit on par now with the UK on cases per million. Germany is a little bit under that, and you can see Canada coming up the rear, but everybody's going in the wrong direction. You want to be going down, not up, and that's part of our challenge today. Sticking with Europe, the European CDC is monitoring all of the communities in Europe, and you want to be in the green. It's okay to be in the orange, but you definitely don't want to be in the dark red. So you can see almost all of Europe is in the midst of this major outbreak, except some countries in Scandinavia and in Southern Europe there. Same holds true in the US. If you look at the US perspective on a county by county basis, the red is not good. It means that the cases are escalating and it's putting the healthcare system at risk. So that's quite disconcerting. We've been hearing about that in the news, and you can see kind of the central, north central parts of the US, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Michigan, being significantly impacted today. And actually some of the highest fatality rates are now in North and South Dakota in the whole world. And things are going up in the wrong direction. That's all in the news. Now, one data point that comes out of Washington State University is a data point that's been in the news quite a bit. This is actually looking at what the projected trends are. And the purple kind of in the middle is what's expected to go in the US. If the US states and communities reduce their mandates and let people, get around in larger groups, and they stop masking and they don't social distance, then you can see there's a major dramatic red peak. If they do have universal masks, you can see that is significantly mitigated. So we'll look at this at a country and state level and show that really the data is showing that if you do the right things, you can mitigate this outbreak, but if you don't, it can be quite severe. Here's the story for Washington State, whether you put masks in place or not, and whether you ease or not. They're looking at a peak, predicted to be somewhere, mid-January, beginning of February. And if you look at Washington State on its own, you can see that certain communities are being impacted where others are not. And I think that's an important message as you look at anywhere in the world. We don't live in states, we live in communities within counties, within states. And yes, we do travel between states, but people are just not traveling as much right now. So looking at what's happening in your community and nearby in your community is really relevant to kind of where you are as an organization, and of course, obviously your personal health. The Washington State has a dashboard, and you'll see that each of these states have their own dashboards. Can be a little confusing collecting information, looking at the data. What are the key data points as an organization should you look for? What we're typically looking at now is cases per 100,000 on a 14-day moving average. We can talk about that, but the challenge with a lot of these databases is that everyone's kind of using slightly different systems and there hasn't been consistency. So it's how you kind of articulate the language of what's happening around, not just in your state, but even globally. Washington State, also going in the wrong direction, escalating as well. But I think it's important to put things in perspective. If we look at, if we picked all of the states and provinces and we jumbled them up together and we risk ranked them by the case activity on a daily rate, this is per million, you can see that Washington State would be the 43rd highest state in the country in North America, actually, with their case activity of 243 per million. And if you look at British Columbia, it would be considered the 51st or so state. As you can see, it's down at 118. So quite frankly, it's a lot less active that's going on. You can see Ontario's a little bit behind that. I'm in California right now, and by the way, I'm a Canadian too. So I'm a transplanted Canadian now living in California. So you can see that California's a little bit less than Washington State right now. But as you know, within each of these states and provinces, there's a lot of variability. If you're looking at Canada, that's Canada's picture. And if you look at where BC is, they're around 13 cases per 100,000. And if you look at the hotspots in Canada in the same way, you can see that, the prairie provinces are seeing outbreaks. You can see Quebec is having significant outbreaks, and southwestern Ontario is also having more outbreaks in those areas too. We typically start to see this in some of the denser populated areas, and then it kind of spreads into the more rural communities. That's been kind of the method that the virus has followed. And if you look at BC, again, if we're really aggressively masking, you can see we can almost mitigate this wave. But if we kind of keep things the way they're going, we're looking at a peak a little bit later, probably in February. And if you do a deeper dive into kind of the southern BC area, you can see Fraser Health community. You can see the rate per 100,000 in the last 14 days. It's significantly rising. You can see the little graph there. So where you live, and if you're on Vancouver Island, you can see it's a lot less of a concern than if you are in Fraser Health. And BC's got a nice dashboard. If you haven't seen it, that's what it looks like. And you can really get a lot of granular data down to the specific community that you're living in. And as an organization, part of the challenges is, if you have an office in that location, how large should your jurisdiction of control be? I mean, are you looking at the whole county? Are you looking at a larger area? And I think part of the challenge is, and I'm in Santa Monica, and so Santa Monica has very low rates, but it's in LA County, which is 10.5 million people, and Santa Monica is 100,000 people. And so the question is, which data point do we use? And the reality is people are coming from other, other communities to work in your area. So you're typically using a larger area when you're doing your analysis. So I'm going to move a little bit out of the data into some of the research that's tied to some of the activities that may be going on. So you've heard a lot of experts talk about the winter fall season being particularly bad this year. We've been predicting it for a long time. There's a number of reasons for that. Obviously, people get indoors. It's raining, it's cold, there's snow. They can't have dinner outside. Restaurants can't really serve outside, and you're basically stuck inside. So one factor is basically people getting together in communities, having to be indoors. And we're seeing that ventilation's a major driver of infection. The other factor is temperature. So we always knew that the virus survives better in colder temperature, but it's actually pretty dramatic. The best way to get rid of the virus is to heat up your house to about 30 to 40 degrees Celsius. Well, it's not really very practical, but the sweet spot for the virus to get rid of it is 30 to 40 Celsius and about 50 to 65% humidity. The bad is to be around 0 Celsius with either low or high humidity, and the virus can last days and even months on surfaces. So you can see how the combination of people inside, cold weather, is leading to most likely a lot of the outbreaks that we're seeing today around the world. Maybe some good news to throw in there. Moderna, you may have seen, which is a brand new vaccine, has been shown to be almost 95% effective. They've vaccinated over 25,000 people. Each of them gotten two shots of the vaccine. They've identified, and they split them into 2 groups, those that got a placebo, basically saline shots, and those that got the actual vaccine. And 95 people came down with COVID. 90% of those got the saline shot. 5 of them were vaccinated and still got it. And that's a very, very good rate. The other good news is that 11 people had serious disease and none of them were from the vaccinated group. So the good news is it looks like it's very effective. And it also, if it does break through and someone does get sick, they're not getting as sick as the others that didn't have the vaccine. So it requires -4 Fahrenheit storage. It also can last 30 days and can be kept at room temperature for 12 hours. And all those things are relevant when you come to distributing the vaccine. If you look at Moderna versus Pfizer, in the US, they're looking at 20 million being available by the end of the year for Moderna and 50 million for Pfizer. And the other key thing is that both of them require 2 shots for each person. The Moderna one is a monthly basis, and the Pfizer is every 3 weeks. You can see the cost there that they're charging for those vaccines, though I suspect in Canada this will be covered by the government. And both of them being very, very effective. So Moderna is distributed around the world, but not everywhere. You can see Canada as a higher proportion of Moderna than Pfizer. The US has got kind of almost a 50-50 split between the two. And the other key thing in Canada is really leading the world in procuring vaccine for the population. So almost for every person, there's almost 10 vaccines that's been ordered for every Canadian. So that's a good news story for Canada compared to everywhere in the world. It's the #1. So they're really, betting against all the vaccines to hopefully make sure that they have lots of vaccine ready for everybody. So we're constantly asked, what's our crystal ball outlook going to be? So here's mine. We are going to see more waves coming. We're going to see businesses, slide back into more conservative postures. We're going to have lockdowns in affected areas. We're going to hopefully get the first vaccines, probably one of those two, if not both, by the end of the year. You're going to see the first priority people getting vaccinated, which are typically going to be healthcare workers and high-risk individuals. We might start to see some businesses start to open gingerly as things settle down. We're seeing additional vaccines being authorized. So these two are not the only vaccines. There's over 100 vaccines in development right now. Another one, which I've got my eye on, is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That only needs 1 shot, and it doesn't need the same kind of refrigeration. So that might be much easier to distribute and to develop. So more people getting vaccinated through the spring. So really, we're not probably going to see the mass population start to get vaccinated into the spring and early summer. And then we might start to see some travel starting then. And then as we get into next fall, we're going to get more vaccine accessibility. We're going to see more expansion of business, international travel, and we'll start to see a lot of the emerging markets access the vaccine. So remember, in some ways, we're very lucky in the US and Canada that our governments, have the resources to fund and access a lot of these vaccines. Many countries in the world do not have that. They don't even have the testing, and they're going to be slower to the table. And then the following year is getting the vaccine to everybody. The really bad news is that they're not expecting the world to be fully vaccinated potentially until 2024, which is just crazy. But that's the challenge we have is distributing to 7 billion people this vaccine. And again, I think the experts are 50-50 on whether this is going to be a one-time vaccine versus a seasonal vaccine. And I think the betting is probably going to be that we may need multiple vaccines and a second shot every year, or another shot every year. So we're going to be in recovery next year. We're going to start to get back to normal the following year, and kind of what is the new normal. And I think that what we're going to see coming out of this, and we will come out of this. So I think we're all hunkering down now for kind of a nasty fall. But there's light at the end of the tunnel, and people shouldn't, think that the world's going to end here. We will get out of this, and there will be a lot of relief, and a lot of potential overindulgence. If you look back at 1918, the Spanish flu, that was the major pandemic that went on for a year and a half, and what followed was the Roaring '20s, when everyone was partying and having a great time. And that might have been a reaction to the fact that the world was holed up very much like we are now, not able to socialize, not able to to be with other people. And then once finally the doors are open, we might see this overindulgence evolve. But we'll still be, a little fragile, skeptical of what's going on, depending on how well we manage things. And from a business perspective is how can you get your operations growing, being productive, and managing your people. So with all of that in mind, the challenge is what's out there. And the reality is we're always going to have these threats. This pandemic really was not unexpected. If you had to put it into the category, it was expected and known. But there's also things that are going to come up that are expected and unknown, and unexpected and unknown. And the categories there are all viable, and they all need to be challenged by our organizations. Now, when we were talking about a pandemic always coming, the one thing that was unknown is that we weren't sure. We all assumed it was going to be an influenza pandemic, and the fact that it's a coronavirus pandemic was somewhat unknown. But we did know about coronaviruses. There's 4 coronaviruses that are in the human population today, and another 2 that were emerging coronavirus, the SARS virus and MERS. So it's not that they were not unknown, and it's not that they weren't expected. The question was timing. So with all of that in context, that pandemics ultimately always occur, it's just a question of timing. We also have another group of factors that are influencing the world, and one is climate, and the second is population. And when you've got the climate changing, when you got humans' population growing, that impacts health, and that really requires us to be much more resilient. And I don't want to go into too much detail here, but and I think we all kind of know this, but we have carbon dioxide increasing dramatically. We have emissions and temperature going up around the world. We have ice melting, which is affecting our shorelines. We have more cities and more people in urban populations, more densely populated, which leads to more opportunities for communicable diseases. And we have less of the land being forested. And this heating of the world as well leads to more mosquito-borne diseases. So all of those places that had malaria or have malaria are likely to expand. So we might see mosquito-borne diseases in more places around the world where we didn't have them before. And it's not just mosquitoes, it's ticks, it's other insects that thrive in certain environments, typically when it's warmer. So this is Lyme's disease by ticks, and you can see its distribution dramatically changing in a decade. And so these are all things that are going to influence the health of our communities and our workforces. And with the temperature changes, we're going to see more storms, more hurricanes, more heat waves, more wind, more winter storms, and all of these things have major implications on us and our operations. So the influence of all these climatic impacts are going to be both medical and physical. And we're going to have to help and see how we can leverage some of the vaccine work that we're doing now and extrapolate that to other preventative measures. But this is also going to put stress on everybody, and mental stress, and it'll affect the mental health of our individuals and of our people in the workforce. And as a community, it will also put challenges on us. How do we keep everybody stable and resilient and supportive? So we have a lot of, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're already talking about what a post-COVID world looks like, what this means. And I would say that if you had to put the top kind of 5 things out there, it's kind of climate-related events. It's vector-borne diseases, and we saw this with Zika. We've seen this with more malaria and dengue, but we might see other mosquito-borne diseases come up. And we're going to have more communicable diseases as population density increases, people and animals mixing together. This is what it can lead to. And with people and animal mixing together, that really is, and minxing together, I should say. These are minks in Denmark. And unfortunately, there was a jump of a coronavirus from a minx to humans. And 12 people are known to have caught the disease. Another 200 might have contracted some strains of this virus. So they're looking at culling 17 million of these animals. And so the mix between animals and humans, it's often a very common jumping point for infectious disease and communicable diseases. And it's one of the challenges that we face going forward. So with that, I will pause and let Jim jump in with any further comments.
Thanks very much, Myles. And you've given us a ton of background and context, and there's some great questions already coming up about COVID. So just for everybody, you can submit your questions on the Zoom Q&A. If possible, use the chat. The production team will be monitoring the Whova app, and we'll bring the Q&As in here, and I'll see them. And if you're sharing any takeaways from this, please use the hashtag Rising Economy Week 2020. So, I think, Myles, the big question here is if we define black swan events, right, and they have kind of three key criteria, as Nassim Taleb said, it was must be an outlier, must have a major impact, must be declared predictable in hindsight. This seems to hit that, but there's a bit of debate out there as to whether COVID is a black swan event and what we can learn from this. So do you want to just talk a bit about the other kinds of things that you see and how you would sort of categorize this as an outlier, major impact, and predictable in hindsight?
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's like a lot of things. There are experts studying so many different topics right now that if you spoke to the right expert at the right time, he would say, this is not a black swan. I could have told you that this outbreak was going to happen because of the research we've been doing. And so, we've, myself personally, I mean, for 20 years, we've been talking to organizations around preparing for a pandemic. And, it started in the early 2000s when bird flu, that was going to be the big thing, H5N1, and pandemic plans were built. And we saw harbingers of something coming, which never really happened. Right. And then we had H1N1, which was swine flu, which was a pandemic, but it wasn't really that severe a pandemic. So I think people kind of dropped their guard a little bit on this. And there's only so many balls that you can juggle in the air as an organization to kind of focus your attention. But we always knew that, every 10 to 30 years, you have a major pandemic. And we've seen this throughout the course of human history. So, and typically we've been, as I say, focusing on influenza pandemics, which are respiratory outbreaks. But this coronavirus was unusual, but not unheard of, right? It was one of those potential threats out there that could produce a pandemic. It had to be the right type of virus. If you looked at SARS, and Canada was on the front line of SARS, it was a very similar coronavirus, but for some reason, it did not produce a global pandemic effect, right? It was just in small pockets, and it was never able to replicate itself widely in the community. And MERS-2, which is the Middle East coronavirus, started from camels, and then we've been watching it and floating around, and it's never been able to spread widely either. And it's been around for over a decade. So we're continually monitoring and doing surveillance globally. And I would say every month at least there's monkeypox, or there's some kind of new weird thing that some scientist somewhere has identified. And the question is this going to jump and become the next big thing? And the thing is that the next big thing is how effectively we can get on top of it early and do the surveillance and also mitigate it, and try to contain it. So I think, whether it was, I wouldn't, from my perspective, it's not a black swan, because, it's within the parameters of what we might consider a potential pandemic virus. But that doesn't mean we can't get some weird thing, right? If the permafrost starts to melt and some weird ancient virus, starts to spread, that would potentially be a real black swan.
There's a ton of great questions circling around this idea of, so what do we do? We're pretty good at reacting. I think that the medical community is working at lightning speed to provide vaccines and information and data, as you shared with us. The questions seem to be, is there a decision-making framework that, for instance, you and the organizations you work with, and just for everybody's context, Myles has a weekly call with the top executives in the US and around the world to kind of give them structure and hope. And so maybe, Myles, you can talk a bit about, not specifically coronavirus, but more holistically and systemically, what can organizations, what can communities, what can groups like South Island Prosperity Partnership and Pacific Northwest Economic Region, what advice can you give to them and their members on a framework for looking at dealing with this in the future so that we don't have to react as much or as hard as we've had to?
No, it's a great question. So a little bit of the history of how I was involved in this was, we had organizations and some of the biggest companies in the world coming to us and saying, hey, we needed a plan. We need a pandemic plan. And what we realized was we produced this beautiful, big, thick binder of information. And for a number of years, it was kind of a standard, that a lot of companies used. But what we realized is that it's a dynamic document. The thing changes. And not only that, pandemic just means something that's going to go around the world. It's not definitive enough, right? So we were actually building a influenza plan, right? Because we know what influenza does. Now, and so people took their influenza plans and jerry-rigged it for COVID-19. So people that had a influenza pandemic plan, it got them a little bit ahead of the curve because they had some of the processes in place. I mean, we can tell you that in January, a lot of the major companies in the world had already distributed masks to their employees, had already organized social distancing way before the US CDC or the World Health Organization has said it. We told people, 3 weeks before it was called a pandemic, that this is a pandemic, right? And so one of the challenges organizations have is that, if you rely on the government authorities, sometimes you're behind the curve because the authorities have to be very systematic, very organized, very structured in making their decisions. They got to get everybody around the world to agree to it. Whereas you're saying, I got to do something today. I can't wait, right? And so companies have a methodology that they built, a process to assess the situation, to have the communications ready, to have an organized response. So pandemic's one thing, but I'll give you another example. Measles. Measles was a major issue last year before this all happened. There were measles outbreaks all over the place, and companies were getting shut down with measles. Measles is 100 times, I'm not sure the exact number, more infectious than COVID. I mean, it floats in the air, everybody gets it. And so there are dozens of health threats that are known knowns, right? We know how to vaccinate for measles. We know how to prepare for measles. We know how to deal with cholera. We know how to deal with dengue, right? And so what we've done is help organizations give them all that content. So when something happens, they've got it at their fingertips, because the last thing you want in the middle of a crisis is trying to jerry-rig something together off of the internet and build and try to organize your communications and give advice without having it planned. So when we talk about the black swan, it's almost like there's 40 or 50 threats that you can actually have pre-written plans for that just makes your life incredibly easy. And so we actually built a technology that you can actually go get all this content real time and use it and customize it and tweak it. So a lot of companies are using that kind of architecture and technology to help them basically steal the intelligence and use it when they need it.
Your comment about the roaring 20s post the flu pandemic, it's been said a number of times by people that, we as a generation, for the most part, have not been through a world war. and therefore we're not as resilient as the Greatest Generation or those that came out of the First World War. But I'm wondering if you believe, just from a almost psychological profile of the countries and the regions affected by this, whether we as communities can and must be better prepared for this going forward. What do you think we'll learn our lesson through this? Do you think we will have exercised enough muscles? Or, to your point, is every event so particular that it's not really transferable? So I guess two parts there: the transferability, and also, are you seeing any indications that there are going to be lasting positive effects for us to address the next major issue, whatever it might be?
Yeah, look, I think what will be measured in the future is the communities that responded rapidly and effectively, how it impacted, what the ultimate impact was to their community, right? Unfortunately, in the US, this whole outbreak has been politicized, and there's been a lot of misinformation. And if you look back at 1918, it was the same story. A pandemic is a political event because you've got this balance between, stopping everybody and giving people the freedom, right? So we saw this in 1918. There was huge uproars about anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers and all this. So it's inevitable that we're going to deal with that. So I think leadership is going to be critical, and you're going to see the organizations, the communities that had strong leaders that gave clear advice, that were open about their information. Hey, we don't know what it is, but here's our best plan today. And then once we get more information, okay, now we're adjusting it as we got that information. People respect that, right? And I think that we're going to see certain communities that are going to be great examples of success, and that they'll become kind of the platform for future challenges that we might have. I think Australia has done an amazing job in what they've done. We've seen a lot of the Asian countries do really, really well. But socially, those are things maybe that in North America we just can't politically do, right? So you have to understand what your community is willing to accept. Are they willing to put a wall between your street and the next street and say you can't go across that street, which they did in China? It's not going to be acceptable. So I think that's the balancing act. And you also can't shut down business, right? You can't shut down people's livelihoods. So you got to find that balance. And also, how do you do testing and all of these different pieces that we brought to bear? If we're smart, we need to leverage that information to the best that we can. So the lessons learned will come out, and they're going to be community by community, and we're going to see some superstar communities and say, wow, they did this, and hopefully that will become the standard. So without naming names, but because you've got this amazing access to what some of the great organizations around the world have done well and haven't done well, can you give us an example of an organization and what they've done to respond really well to this that has allowed them to accelerate their return to normal or to hit their growth, and not things that are specific to their industry and that they're okay, but who are the organizations, or give us the stories behind some of the organizations that you've seen and maybe some of the tricks of the trade, again, without giving away who they are unless you can. I think that would be really helpful for people to understand that there are groups that are succeeding with this and well ahead of the curve. Yeah, look, I think it does come down to the type of work you do and the industry you're in. So we saw pretty early on, and we've done a lot of work in the heavy industry, the oil and gas industry, mining, remote site projects. That's kind of our part of our core business. So we saw a lot of those groups that said, look, I got my guys in the workplace. They have to work. If they don't work, the mine shuts down, and we're screwed. So how do we leverage the resources we have to get them working? And so they organize a very structured testing, screening process, zoning process, so that the whole workplace was organized. You can't go to that red zone. You can only stay in the green zone. If you want to go to the red zone, you got to be 2 weeks in quarantine. So really structured, regimented, regulations for how the workplace works. and accessing and zoning the workplace. And that's been really successful. And we saw that even in Ebola. We were running, major mines in Ebola countries, and we had a really structured zoning and screening process, and no one got Ebola, right? So we kept it going. If you look at other industries, we do a lot of work with the tech industries, everyone's working from home. So, you don't have that same level of, challenge, but they want to ensure that even their people from working from home are supported. And even tech companies have people that have to go to China, meet with their vendors, they still have to do work. And so managing those people that are going into high risk environments, what are all the resources you can put to bear to make sure that they're safe and secure, and screening them and testing them. And then the third industry that's quite interesting is the media and entertainment industry. So we're doing a lot of work with them. So if you want to shoot a movie, how do you get your actors to do, intimate scenes in the middle of a pandemic, right? So the whole industry has created a whole infrastructure of and a methodology of zoning the actual area where they're doing the filming, the testing of all these people, but literally they're doing hundreds of tests a day. And so if you've got the ability to do the testing, and you've got the PPE and equipment, you've got a lot more flexibility to do what you want to do, but it costs tons of money. So you've got this challenge between cost, between availability, and between the ability to control your workforce, right? And those three factors play into what companies are doing. But they're screening people. They have digital screening tools to enter the workplace. We help them do contact tracing. So every case is contact traced through their system. They've got medical advisors. Most of the companies now have medical advisors that advising them, should this guy go back to work? When can he go back to work? Because they realize the local public health authority just doesn't have the bandwidth to support them. They need to be able to support themselves. And I think that's one of the big messages with a lot of the companies was they initially thought their authorities could help them, but it's just too much, right? So if they want to do it, they got to do it themselves.
So a bunch of great questions coming in, actually too many for us to get to in the last sort of 5 minutes or so before we wrap up with some final comments. So just so everybody knows, there are a lot of very specific questions about COVID and vaccines. I really want to, there's a really interesting question, and it's from Bruce Cuthbert, who talked about the fact that Y2K was a non-event because of the incredible coordination around the world. And again, you were, I think, in the U.S. at that time, or I'm not sure if you were still in Russia. But wherever you were, we were all preparing for this thing that didn't happen. But as Bruce says, much of India's current technology status is a follow-up to the work during the Y2K preparation. And so one of the great questions is, how can we as a region, BC and the Pacific Northwest, leverage this for our future? What are some of the areas that we as a region can focus on to take advantage of the work that has gone into coming together and coordinating through this crisis? Do you see any knock-on effects? And it connects with another one that Mostyn Finley wrote, which was about how do you what are some of the second and third ripple effects that we would see down the road that actually could be good? Yeah,
well, look, taking the second question first, I mean, I think one thing the good news about all this is we have never in the human history spent more time on one subject than this subject, right? You've got all the world experts focused on one subject, doing the more research than in anything else ever. So I think the knock-on is going to be very exciting for vaccines, for prevention, for treatment, for understanding how the whole immune system of the human body works. I mean, the research we're finding is just, amazing. And I think it's going to have a significant impact on the future health of how we deal with these communicable diseases in the future, particularly viral diseases. So we're doing probably 20, it usually takes 10 years to get a vaccine to market. We're doing it in 9 months. We've done 10 years of research in about 9 months too. So I think the exciting thing is there's going to be a lot of positive knock-on effects, from that perspective. Now, how do you as a community, as a region, leverage best practices. And I think, so there's a couple ways to do that. I mean, what we try to do on our side, if you look at our kind of community that we support, is that we're actually right now looking at some tools to help organizations also benchmark where they are against each other. One of the things that we see a lot of interest in, and even the biggest countries in the world just want to know, I need a benchmark. Am I too much? Am I not enough? Am I right in the middle? Am I in the sweet spot of what I should be doing? So because we work with so many clients, we're trying to see how do we pull all this data together and show kind of what that benchmark information is. And so I think within your group, as simple as some polling, regular polling that you're doing, to saying, hey, look, we're in Vancouver, we're in North Van, here's our population, this is our industry, this is kind of where we are today. Where 10% of our employees are coming back to work, whatever the data points you want to get, sharing that I think is very useful. And we're seeing a lot of power in companies wanting to know kind of where they sit amongst that spectrum.
Great idea to do this sharing, and I think that certainly SIP and Pacific Northwest Economic Region through this is trying to do some benchmarking. But yeah, I think there are some great technologies to be leveraged there. Here's a tough one to almost wrap us up from Mary Brooke, and I love the pointedness of this question. And because you're a friend, I'll ask it. Did you predict this for your clients? Did you help them prepare? I mean, you talked a bit about the sort of early warning signs in January, but how surprised were you? And did you get any calls from people saying, Druckman, what the hell?
So
you could have told me.
I'll tell you what, it's funny that you should say that. So I had to give a talk to the global security directors. It was in San Diego in mid-January, right? And it was all the top security executives in the world. There's about 300, 400 in this room. And I can't remember, the talk was about, that was even before COVID had a name. Remember, it was this new virus in China. And I went up there and I said, look, here's what's going on. I said, but this does not look good. And I suspect that there's a very good chance that this is going to become a pandemic. And I had guys come up and roll their eyes and go, yeah. And then, but I did about a month later, I was on a call, and the security guy says, oh, you're the guy that predicted what was going to go on. Because what I would continually do is I would say, okay, here's my crystal ball. Here's what I think is going to happen, And I said, look, there's going to be a pandemic and it's going to start on Wednesday. I'm not going to tell you what year it's going to be, but it's going to be Wednesday, right? So, I think, you want to be, it was nuanced because, a lot of things have to come into play. But the thing about organizations is that we, have the luxury of potentially being ahead of the curve, right? Governments don't necessarily have the luxury. We can shut down. If they don't want us to shut down, we can shut down, right? We just can't open if they don't tell us to open. So I think from an organizational perspective, as I said, we saw a lot of companies literally a month and a half, 4 to 5 weeks ahead of what the governments were saying. They had already stopped travel. They had already stopped their people going into those places. They already had masks with everybody. They already had hand sanitizers. They were already screening people at the door before any of the guidance came out, right? And the CDC and the WHO were saying, well, it might be airborne, and they didn't want to say it was airborne because if they say it's airborne, it's nasty. And if they say everyone needs to wear a mask and there's not enough masks, you can't say wear a mask if there's not enough masks, right? So, but as a company, you can buy masks, and companies were buying millions of masks and millions of stuff. So they had already an inventory waiting for this big thing to happen. And so the question was, when do you pull the trigger to start doing it? And I think that's what we're seeing. A lot of the best companies, what I always say is the best prepared companies are the ones that have been hit the hardest. So, you see the ExxonMobils, the Chevrons, the reason they are like world-class is because they've been hammered the most. Once you get hit by a major disaster and your business shuts down and you lose $1 billion, every 2 weeks or whatever, it becomes a big issue. So I think that's another thing, is a lot of the smaller companies need to learn from the bigger ones. There's a reason why they are spending all of this effort to do these things, because when it does happen, it's a business continuity issue. So I think that's a big challenge. And I think the other thing that we underestimate is the supply chain challenge people have. Is, great, I've looked after myself, my guys are great, but I can't get, the bolts from wherever because they're shut down there. So understanding that it's more than just you that you've got to support.
Just to give some context to everybody as to why Myles and I were dressed in those green suits and I had a patch on my eye. And I think it's relevant to what you just said. So it's a great wrap up and a nice segue. On our expedition, which was a 3-month expedition through Western Siberia and Baffin Island, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we were still working with, half of our team were Soviets and half were Canadian. And I think it's fair to say that you, as the expedition leader, you warned us all that something was going to happen. In fact, many things were going to go wrong, right? What I think surprised me, and on reflection shouldn't surprise me, is that the Soviets, the Russians, were far more sanguine about stuff and actually were quite well prepared. Actually, they weren't as well prepared, but they took things in stride because they had stuff happen to them on a daily basis as the system was falling apart, and even when it was in place. Whereas Canadians, we were a little surprised by all of these things. But it came down to our attitudes and the ability for us to cooperate. And so I think that one of the key takeaways here is that, to the extent that we're talking about a Pacific Northwest region, which does not respect borders in the same way that the virus doesn't respect borders, we really want to be looking at how are we much more alike and what are we all learning and what are the different kind of resiliencies that each of us has, organizations and governments. Because I think as we learned on that expedition, no matter how well prepared we are, Myles still comes up to you and says, yeah, you may not survive that one.
Absolutely. Well, the military are classic in that, you plan, but then as soon as the action hits, the plan goes out the window and you got to adapt, right? And so I think we're a little bit in that mode too. But and the other thing about these things is that it's a long road, right? We knew right off the bat. I remember saying when this first was pandemic we hit, people were saying, well, next week we'll be going back to school. Next week, I said, this is going to be 6 months. And they said, what? So our time horizon too for these things, and frame of reference is important as well.
Well, listen, I'm personally very grateful for this, and there's a lot of great comments coming up saying the same thing, Myles. It's great that we have a Canadian at the helm of this international organization in the hotspot of California. People can find you if they have any questions, and you've got other photos of us doing crazy things that we barely survived. But Myles, thanks very much for connecting with us and sharing your expertise. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim. No, it was a pleasure.